"The damned Sixers are plotting a mutiny again," Glan said, enjoying watching Molt inspect and maintain the weapons with his usual skill. There was no official position of armorer, but since Molt was the best at this job, he was usually assigned to do the regular inspections. Glan remembered his childhood in the two before the celestial wrath. Back then, the sectors had not yet become separate warring small principalities. The confrontation between the southern and northern zones was growing. The people were getting more and more nervous, and duty at the Stargazer was the only stable factor in the life of the people. Glan's father was one of the officers of the guard, and sometimes took his son with him on duty. Glan remembered the neat racks of weapons and armor in the North Zone armory. There had been enough weapons for the entire male population of the 5 sectors. However, far fewer people live in all 10 sectors combined now. Celestial wrath and a series of rebellions and intersector clashes had done their damage. "The Sixers are always up to something," Molt said, placing another spear in a special niche. The cold bluish light of the lamp glinted on the broad, long blade of the dark metal point. "They're unhappy about equal access to the Stargazer for all sectors, though I don't know why they want preferential treatment. I doubt they are willing to work double time on hydroponic farms just to feed a few extra slackers." 3 more spears were lying on the desk in front of him. He took one of them and meticulously inspected the graphite shaft, then took a can of protective grease and began to rub the point. Glan sighed. Like most young men, Molt was a skilled warrior and a fine armorer, but not a very good politician. In 2 big turns, the Grand Council would be held. Glan closed his eyes. The light in the armory was too bright for him, who was used to the dim lighting of the warehouses. The amount of duty served by each sector will significantly affect how the Grand Council goes and what decisions are made. All sectors want a decisive voice in planning for the next 10 grand turns. "This is all nonsense," Molt said, taking up the next spear. "If everyone would just mind their own business and pay less attention to idle talk, grandfatherly fables, and scare stories, life would be much simpler and quieter." Glan looked at the young man with a frank chuckle. "Boy, you realize you're talking to someone who was on duty at the Stargazer during the time of the celestial wrath, don't you?" Molt was clearly embarrassed, but pretended to be absorbed entirely in examining some microscopic flaw on the tip of his spear to have an excuse not to look up at Glan. "Well, that's not exactly what I meant," he mumbled. "What I meant was that people pay too much attention to politics and history instead of to the issues at hand." "That's something I'm willing to agree with," Glan said, glancing at the clock on the wall. "Are you done? The sector council starts in 20 minutes, and I still have to return to my place." Molt put the last spear back in its place, stood up, and buckled his sword in its modestly designed scabbard on his belt. "Come," he said. "It is not good to be late for the council." Ever since Councillor Kane had been attacked and seriously wounded by some unidentified intruder while returning from an evening tour of the distant hydroponic farms, the sector council had decided that all officials should have guards. Glan didn't want some grim, big, armed thug with him everywhere, so he convinced the council that his nephew could guard his precious person. The council squeaked, but Glan's opinion, who had a lot of authority, had to be reckoned with. Molt wasn't exactly thrilled about the unexpected new position, but Glan promised not to distract him too much from his main job. Eventually, Molt moved into a vacant apartment next door to the old counselor's place. In more than 2 weeks, they had established a new routine that more or less suited both uncle and nephew. Glan didn't travel around much, even in his home sector, and he only went outside of it to visit the Grand Council administration, which did not happen too often. Glan was much less bound by regular duties and rigid schedules than Molt. From time to time, he would switch places with his guard, accompanying Molt when he performed his duties as an armorer or combat instructor and one of the deputies of the sector militia. Glan himself had long since been exempted from military service by age, and he was interested in observing how this important part of sector life had changed since the celestial wrath. The conclusions from these observations were disappointing, though Glan realized that it was unlikely that anyone else was aware of this but him, including veterans of the celestial wrath like himself. On the one hand, the sector's defense was now at a reasonable level, even with the reduced population. After all, there were fewer people everywhere. In addition, Sector 5 had been destroyed long ago, which meant that access to Sector 8 was now only possible through the central area of Stargazer or the transitions to Sectors 6 and 9. The passage to the 7th sector had been blown up during the Great Unrest 90 great turns ago, and had never been rebuilt. Defending 3 frontiers was much easier than 5. On the other hand, Glan was gradually becoming convinced that the defense and survival of the sector were quickly becoming the primary goal, and that duty at the Stargazer and the training of watchers were seen by the younger generation as meaningless and burdensome ritual duties. The days of celestial wrath, when entire sectors disappeared under the raging flames, when people died by the hundreds, were, for those born later, just a cautionary tale from the past. The kind of story you tell children in the evening to make them behave. As for the veterans like Glan, most of them had gradually sunk into the abyss of continuous political intrigue and power struggles. Glan suspected they were trying to shut themselves off from reality in this way, but it did not affect the outcome. The base had clearly lost its former vital bearings. Of course, the fact that almost all the archives and libraries had been lost during the Great Unrest and during the Celestial Wrath, the school had been destroyed, along with most of the teachers and the rest of the textbooks, didn't help either. The databanks had been out of service for so long that even Glan had not seen them working, not counting the calculator at the Stargazer. And for the youth, these devices were mythological. Oral tradition was good only for family legends, but not for training qualified personnel to work at the Stargazer. Now, as another political crisis was brewing that could well be resolved by violence, it seemed to Glan that he was the last person who remembered that the entire base had originally been built to keep the Stargazer in operation. This realization should have terrified the old counselor, but in truth, he felt only lingering, hopeless despair. As could be expected, the council once again failed to decide anything useful except to approve a schedule of increased patrols on the sector's borders and to draft a diplomatic note to the Council of Sector 6 that the manipulation of duty at the Stargazer for the sake of short-term political preferences was unacceptable. Glan didn't participate in either discussion. He didn't see the point. Molt and his comrades were more skilled in managing defense, and the note was a mere formality. The extremists who had seized power in the 6th would surely ignore it. Unlike most of the guards of the other council members, Molt did not take the opportunity to loiter in the specially designated room. He quietly sat on a chair at the farthest wall of the council chamber and carefully watched what was happening. Strictly speaking, council meetings were not considered secret, and any resident of Sector 8 was entitled to attend. But by long-established unspoken tradition, no one came to these meetings unless necessary, and some conservative-minded counselors cast disapproving glances at Molt. The latter, however, did not pay the slightest attention to it. Leaving the council chamber after the meeting, Glan and Molt walked silently. Glan waited patiently, realizing the young man was thinking about something important. Finally, Molt looked at the counselor and said, It seems that things are much worse than I thought. Glenn cast a questioning glance at him, not showing he understood what Molt was talking about. Molt walked a few more steps as if on parade, then stopped and turned to his uncle. "We've been hearing rumors," he said, "from other sectors. You know, no one's formally forbidden to move from sector to sector, even given the recent tensions. A lot of people have relatives or friends outside their suite. So, I don't know why the council keeps quiet about this. Either they don't know or they don't believe it. Anyway, it's looking like something bad will happen on the next watch change." "A mutiny?" Glenn looked at Molt. "Why were you silent about it at the meeting?" Molt shrugged his shoulders. "I don't have any proof, only rumors. Besides," he hesitated, "I was under the impression that no one on the council would be surprised or even interested in such a statement." The young man frowned, clearly making an important decision. "Actually, I shouldn't be telling you this," he said finally. "In fact, by talking to you about it, I'm violating a direct order because you're a member of the council. The militia command has long ago decided not to inform the council about their plans for the future." Molt looked at his uncle, trying to find out how dumbfounded he was by the news. But if he had hoped to make a spectacular impression, he had miscalculated. Glenn had long suspicions, bordering on certainty, that the command had become disillusioned with the main governing body of the sector and was playing its own game. Unfortunately, none of the other counselors seemed to care about it. Everyone was too busy with political intrigue and playing diplomatic chess with other sectors. But chess could only be played with an adequate opponent, not with a psychopath who could put an axe in your head in response to a piece taken. And even the psychopath doesn't seem to consider that one day an evil giant will come and, with one kick, will send all the boards together with the players to the underworld. Unless, of course, the players can unite and kick the giant. Glenn shuddered. Every day, it seemed to him more and more that the chance for unification was finally and irrevocably gone. As usual, the change of watch ceremony was well attended, including those who, strictly speaking, had nothing to do with working on the Stargazer. The Stargazer Control Center had once been many separate rooms, but it had long since been rebuilt when humans still had the knowledge and technology for such a grand project. Now, it was a spacious hall with a hemispherical roof, in the center of which was the Holy of Holies, the equipment and stations of Stargazer's watchstanders. From the hall ran radial passages to the sectors, which had also been rebuilt many times. Some passages had been destroyed during the Celestial Wrath. Others had been blown up during civil wars and rebellions, while others had simply fallen into disrepair. As long as there was an opportunity, lost by now, people built new passages, connecting sectors directly so that the once clear and symmetrical layout of the settlement gradually became like a spider's web woven by a sloppy drunken spider. Over hundreds of great turns, the protocol of the change of watch had been refined to a fine art. But Glenn had long ago begun to notice that since the days of his youth, even before Celestial Wrath, when he had first been initiated as a watcher, the procedure had become increasingly emasculated, lost its profound essence, and turned into a religious ritual. A special chant had been developed and implemented over a couple of decades, and now the procession of the new shift of watchers entering the Stargazer Hall was making its slow, measured steps to the sound of the chorus of the novices of the Watchers' Corps who had not yet been initiated. Glenn thought he had to give them due. They sang well, the melody was beautiful and solemn, and the whole thing made a great impression on the people gathered in the hall. Still, he remembered a time when the procedure for the change of watch had been spelled with a small letter, and the words spoken by the watchers had not yet become a purely ritualistic set of phrases, but had a specific meaning. Meanwhile, the procession was moving leisurely along the special passageway through the crowd of spectators. Soon, they would come directly to the Stargazer control panel, and each of the 10 pairs of watchers would stand behind the pair they were to replace. This will be followed by the exchange of the change of watch ritual phrases, and one of the new arrivals will sit down at his view screen, in the chair just vacated by his predecessor, and their understudies will exchange handshakes. At this point, the audience usually erupted in applause, after which the relieved watchers would proceed in the same leisurely fashion to the watchers' core quarters, to cleanse themselves, rest, and then return to daily life in their sectors until they were called back to watch. The new shift will be on duty for one minor turn, each member pairing up for 12 hours. Then it will be the same again, and again, and again. Glenn had retired from the Watcher's Corps a decade and a half ago, but now he suddenly felt an acute longing for the old days. A multitude of indicators and gauges, 2 large greenish screens, all of which had to be monitored continuously to not miss the moment, not to miss the beginning of the next celestial wrath. 12 hours of extreme tension, rest, and another 12 hours. During his time as a watcher, Glenn had changed 3 partners. The first one couldn't stand the service and resigned after only 1.5 great turns after initiation. The second died in the celestial wrath. The third was still in the Corps, though the date of his next watch was 1 more turn away. Glenn's heart ached, but something distracted him before he had gotten sentimental. There was a commotion at the far end of the hall, to the left of the entrance to the Watcher's Corps quarters. A ripple ran through the crowd of spectators, as if from a stone thrown into the water, and people moved away, pushing and shoving each other. Glenn strained his eyesight, which had been failing over the last few years, and saw that armed men in red headbands were jumping out of the service passage in the wall, midway between the tunnels to Sector 6 and 7, one by one, and lining up in battle formation, crowding the spectators who had come to watch the ritual. Survivalists, the most radical wing of the extremists who have seized power in Sector 6. The survivalist cult did not even try to cover up or soften their true intentions, openly calling for a violent change in the system of governance of all sectors and the abandonment of the watch, considering it a silly religious prejudice, diverting precious resources needed for the survival of the sectors. The new authorities of Sector 6 had publicly denounced the survivalists' stance, but Glenn believed these statements were merely a smokescreen, a ruse to hide the close ties to the cultists. How he wished he were wrong. Between the tunnels had once been an area with various apparatus rooms, and that was where the service passageway led to. However, that area had taken 2 direct hits during the celestial wrath, and was deemed inaccessible. Its hatches had been welded shut. Somehow, the survivalists managed to rebuild the part of the area and move the fighters there without being noticed. Looks like they had their own people in the security system. However, this could be thought about later, after the crisis was resolved. If that later, of course, will have an opportunity to come. Meanwhile, the survivalists, closing ranks, slowly approached the control panel. They didn't touch the spectators scattering in front of them. At least, they didn't raise their weapons at them, limiting themselves to kicking and throwing aside those frozen with surprise and horror. Glenn noted absently that a small group of survivalists had tried to move toward the doors of the Watcher's Corps, but had been unable to get in. Someone had had the good sense to lock all the doors from the inside. Glenn found himself on a small dais in the center of the hall, where the control panel was. His old instincts had decided where he should be, near the heart and brain of the Stargazer, among the Brother Watchers, even if Glenn himself had not been a member for a long time. The watchstanders, and even those who sat at the console, looked at the approaching rebels with horrified eyes, but Glan was proud to note that none of them had abandoned their posts or fled. But where was Molt? As if in answer to his question, armed militiamen began running out of the Sector 8 tunnel, with Glan's nephew at their head. They were noticeably outnumbered by the rebels. Sector 8 has a smaller population than Sector 6, and it looked like the survivalists had managed to recruit supporters in other sectors as well, at least in Sector 7 and 4. Nevertheless, people from 8 quickly formed a defensive formation around the control panel and stared grimly at the survivalists preparing for battle. Molt turned around and found his uncle looking at him. "They've cut off the unified militia barracks, welded up the hatches in the passages," he shouted, "and many who remained available have either defected to the rebel side or decided to wait it out. That's all I've been able to gather." Glan had lived a long life, seen a lot, and had no illusions. The survivalists outnumbered the defenders of the Stargazer by more than double, 50 men against 24. The odds tended toward 0. The rebels paused to assess the new obstacle and plan their actions. A moment later, a stern-looking 40-year-old man with a thick black beard, apparently one of the leaders, emerged from their ranks. "Forget your stupid toy and leave. We won't hurt anyone if there is no resistance," he roared in the relative silence. "There is no need for bloodshed. It's time to clean up the mess and think of the people." "We are thinking of them," Molt replied. "You want to take away our protection. The memory of the celestial wrath must have faded too quickly." The bearded man snorted contemptuously. "Children's fears. It's just a convenient way for some people to do nothing and live happily ever after. Well, the time of the freeloaders has passed. Now it's our time, the time of real people." He spat and joined the rebel ranks. Glan knew that even among the leaders of the Sixers, there were men old enough to remember celestial wrath, but they obviously preferred to keep their memories to themselves. He didn't know what drove them: personal gain, the desire to forget the horrible past, or something else. It didn't matter now. The irreparable was about to happen, and they would be defenseless before the next celestial wrath. Well, what's to come is what's to go. Glan had never thought about how he was going to die, although such thoughts were supposed to be typical of the elderly. But now reality had given him a clear answer without asking. The counselor looked around the control room. The Stargazer was the main and only meaning of life, not only for him, but for all the inhabitants of the sectors. Unfortunately, the inhabitants themselves seemed to have forgotten that, or didn't want to remember. Attention! The uncertain, frightened voice belonged to one of the new watchers, a young boy with the build of a teenager. It seemed to be his first watch, which would be his last, Glan thought bitterly. The poor fellow was completely confused. He had forgotten that ritual words should not be uttered in vain, but— "Attention," repeated the young observer more firmly. "Multiple targets in Gamma Sector, approach speed 16 and 9. With the Sixers still delaying their attack, the Stargazer defenders waiting grimly, and everyone else has long since scattered to their sectors, the Watcher's words cut through the silence with unexpected clarity. As everyone dazedly digested their meaning, another Watcher, an older one, echoed the first phrase: "Sector Zeta, multiple targets, speed 16 and 7. And then, as if a dam had burst, targets in Sector Alpha, 16 and 3, Sector Eta, Sector Delta. The voices of the Watchers merged into a droning rumble of reports. The ritual phrases suddenly lost their learned formal clarity while taking on a new, formidable meaning. "Attention all posts!" The voice of the watch commander cut through the confusion, halting the flow of reports from various watchers. "Commence target acquisition. All launchers ready. Anti-aircraft batteries and suppressors. Warm up. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a—" The phrase was cut off halfway through by a stifled sob. Glenn, who had been looking over the watcher's shoulder at the Beta Sector's main scanner screen, looked back. The watch commander stood staring in surprise and confusion at the bloody spear point sticking out of his chest. Glenn recognized the spear by its distinctive, unusually curved tip. It was the spear that had been in the hand of the bearded rebel negotiator. The watch commander's hands began to move toward the weapon that had pierced him, but halfway through, they sagged helplessly. His knees buckled, and he slowly fell to his side and did not move again. "Don't listen to the damned deceivers." Glenn couldn't make out the bearded man himself in the rebel squad, but it was his voice. "This is just another trick to confuse us. You know that it's all lies of vile, holy hypocrites. Come on, let's get it over with." The rebels rushed to the attack. At the very last moment before the clash, Glenn met Molt's eyes and managed to say, hoping that the nephew could at least read his lips, 15 minutes. Just give me 15 minutes. Then he turned to the control panel and shouted with all his might, "This is not a drill. Launch to all targets after confirmed captures. Put all orbital anti-aircraft batteries on fire at will mode." Behind his back, the men who had come together in fierce combat screamed. Almost no one noticed. The floor shook as the first missile was launched, and then again, and then began to tremble until a direct hit destroyed all of Sector 7, and a blast wave that outpaced the automation of the escape hatches mixed the attackers, defenders, and observers into one pile and threw them against the far wall of the hall. The day of celestial wrath had come again. The evening breeze drifted lazily over the coastal dunes and tangled itself in the crowns of the pines. The majestic trees sway gently, making them resemble druids singing hymns. The remnants of the breeze ran lightly toward the log house at the edge of the spacious clearing, bringing the thick scent of herbs, tickling the nostrils and inducing slumber. On the house's porch sat an elderly but still sturdy man and a boy of about 7 or 8. "Beautiful," the boy said, looking up at the starry sky, where the bright orange, yellow, and white asters of distant explosions bloomed. "I've seen stars fall, but it's not as cool, and not many at a time." "Beautiful," the man agreed, "but dangerous and scary." The boy looked at him in surprise. "It's not scary at all," he said. "It's scarier when there's a thunderstorm, though I'm not afraid." He hesitated a moment and added, "Well, almost." He had always prided himself on his honesty. The man sighed. "You don't understand. If one of those things falls to the ground, it'll be a big disaster. It's the aggressors." The boy's eyes widened. "Aggressors? The teacher told us about them and that they tried to take over the world. But the wise ancestors found a way to stop the aggressors from succeeding. They built this, what's its name? Moon Defense Vase." "Moon Defense Base," the man corrected with a smile. "Yes, that was before the separation. This base controls all of Earth's orbital defenses." "Why only Earth?" the boy asked. "What about the seas, the rivers, the forests, the people?" "That's what the world used to be called before the separation," the man explained. The boy nodded. "And then all the techno-dependence flew away, and the world became the world. Cleansed." The man shook his head. "You shouldn't say that about humans just because they chose a different path. After all, it is their technology that protects us from the aggressors. They're the ones who built the orbital defense system and the moon base. They are different, but that doesn't mean they are worse than us." The boy pondered this for a while. "Like different ants, eh?" he finally said. "Some build big anthills and others live in hollow trees, but they are all ants. Almost." The man smiled. "Although we are not ants, of course." The boy looked up at the sky again, where the last flashes were less frequent. His eyesight, was sharper than the older man's, and certainly much sharper than his distant ancestors before the separation, but even he couldn't tell for sure whether the moon, whose disk hung above the dark pine trees, had a new crater, or whether it was just his imagination. But the Techno-D, those other people left long ago, didn't they? He said. Do they still live on the moon? The man shook his head. I don't think so. I think they moved on to the stars a long time ago. Their technology was outstanding back in the days of the separation, and it must have gotten even better since then. There's hardly anyone still living on Moonbase. Most likely, the defenses have long been run by automation. I guess those people weren't so bad, the boy said thoughtfully, if they didn't want to control the weapons themselves. I've never seen a gun myself, but my teacher said it was a nasty thing. That's true, said the man, but I think all paths sooner or later lead to the fact that guns are nasty. I guess someday, even the aggressors will realize that. But until then, we should respect all paths, and especially the ancestors who gave us a solid defense. And they both looked up at the dark, bottomless sky filled with stars.